Hola, Bernardo's. Moving on in our survey of 20th century architecture, we're ready to talk about an American great, Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, regardless of what you may think about his personal life, which is actually quite interesting in and of itself, this one architect really advanced American architecture and made it talked about the world over. People were trying to replicate the lessons that Frank Lloyd Wright was learning and teaching. So he spans the 20th century. He's going to reinvent himself to create the New York Guggenheim. So if you've been to New York and you've seen that structure, you're familiar with his brand of architecture. But I want to kind of fill in the dots and lay some things together. And I'll do that by showing you another piece he's known for, the Frank Roby House in Chicago. So here's the video again. Take a short look at this 5-minute introduction, and then we'll come back and pull out the concepts that are important for you to remember for the AP exam.
Fourth building. Its architect called it a source of worldwide architectural inspiration. Humility wasn't Frank Lloyd Wright's strong suit.
You see, early in life I had to choose between honest arrogance and hypocritical humility. I chose honest arrogance.
The Roby House really was a radical departure from your typical middle-class house at the time, which tended to look like a tall box. Ever since he left Louis Sullivan's office, Frank Lloyd Wright had been gradually thinking outside the box in a series of designs leading up to Roby.
Wright was evolving from a sort of tighter, more formal gabled house to the gable was getting lower and more like this, and finally it just becomes like this.
These became known as prairie houses, not just because they were located on the flat lands of the Midwest, but because they seemed to belong here.
It's a part of its environment, and it graces its environment rather than disgraces it.
These daring homes appealed to clients who weren't afraid to take risks, like Frederick and Laura Roby. Frederick was a 28-year-old bicycle manufacturer who had just ventured into the brave new world of automobile supplies.
He was the quintessential young, rebellious guy. He designs a car that's part car and part motorcycle.
Wright shared Roby's passion for the automobile. The result, he included an attached 3-car garage in 1910.
I mean, you're coming out of the age of the stable and the horses. Not for this house.
This prairie house wasn't built on the prairie, but in the city, right next to the University of Chicago. So Roby said he was concerned about privacy. Roby wanted a building where he could see out, but people couldn't see in?
And you had a house with a lot of glass, but just take a look.
Wright hid the inside with art glass windows and a projecting balcony.
Can you see in?
No,
Take a look
not
at them.
really. Today, the house is open to the public, if you can find the door. Wright recessed the entrance. Then you come into a dark, confined reception area, which leads to a narrow stairway. But as you go up the stairs, you turn and ascend toward the light, eventually emerging into a spectacular, bright space. So what is the point of this whole journey, this procession that Frank Lloyd Wright has just taken us on?
Well, it's a thing called drama. Going through a Wright building is playing with your senses, it's playing with your emotions.
As you move through the house, one room flows seamlessly into the next, uninterrupted by walls or doors.
You're in one continuous space.
This revolutionary open plan is completely different from the typical house of the time, which was divided into discrete box-like rooms.
It's literally breaking the box.
And where old-fashioned houses had small windows punched into the walls and covered with drapes, the Roby house had continuous bands of art glass windows.
The light surrounds you, the exterior surrounds you.
And yet, despite all the modern features of this house, Frank Lloyd Wright also gave the Roby family a very traditional gathering place.
And he builds fireplaces for the rest of his career because he's not trying to destroy domesticity or comfort. He sincerely wanted these to be places for families.
But even as he was promoting traditional family values, Frank Lloyd Wright was involved in an affair with the wife of a client. While the Roby house was still under construction, Wright and his mistress left their families and fled to Europe.
which made huge headlines in the paper.
The Roby house wasn't good for Roby's marriage either. A year after moving in, Laura and the 2 kids moved out.
The house was put up for sale. Roby, his great dream house, he wasn't here barely a year.
But Frank Lloyd Wright would return to the Roby house when it was threatened with demolition in 1957. The 89-year-old architect had gone on to design some of America's most famous buildings. But he felt compelled to defend this earlier work, which he not so humbly called a cornerstone of American architecture. By then, it was clear just how influential Frank Lloyd Wright's ideas had become. Builders had been cranking out suburban homes that took a page from Wright's book.
What we would call today the ranch-style house. Low-slung, horizontal, overhanging eaves, low-pitched roofs, and windows gathered together in strips. Where had we seen that before? I remember Frank Lloyd Wright.
When Henry Ford told the
All right, guys. So having watched the short video about the Roby house, you're now looking at an image of what we call Falling Water, or the Philip Kaufman house, another of his iconic Frank Lloyd Wright works. I'm going to fill in the gaps again, kind of walking you backwards and walking you forwards to this very important piece. So I want to kind of go back to the roots of Frank Lloyd Wright. You guys remember he's had a long career at this point already, making structures, working with Louis Sullivan, as a young architecture student, building things all over Chicago. The Oak Park neighborhood where he lived is full of houses that he was working on at the time. So I encourage you guys, if you ever get the chance, to go and see some of these places that are early Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. Wright was very tied to the hands-on approach, and he applied his knowledge of the arts and crafts movement to this piece, the Roby House, which is what you just watched a film about. I just want to point out a couple of things there. You guys can see that roof is cantilevered. You can see the high walls don't allow people to see in. Right behind that wall is a foyer, kind of a rocking chair place where people could gather as if they were on the front porch, but they were completely private in that space when they were there. I think it was really interesting when I visited the Roby house. I had to really look for the front door. It's not around where you normally would think an entrance to a house would be. It's tucked in near the back, so you have to go looking for it. But what's really evident from this are all the horizontal lines, and that's part of the prairie style that we know from Louis Sullivan, but we also now associate with Frank Lloyd Wright. This is what's across the street from his house. It is the neo-Gothic styled campus of the University of Chicago. And Frank Lloyd Wright was like, what is this doing here? As it was being built, he really protested in creating a false history for Americans that never had existed. And that always reminds me of some of our houses in South Lake that look like they have crenellated in exteriors with lots of surface decoration. I mean, guys, we live in Texas, right? We should be building a Texan architecture that really takes care of its site and takes its site into consideration. That's the same kinds of arguments that Wright was saying at the same time. So he thought that the lines of the prairie needed to be incorporated into the house. So you have that happening all over the body of the house. And the video did everything that we need to do with this, but I wanted to show you the floor plan. Just like with Villa Savoye, we have an open plan that allows for screens to simply carve up space without breaking up that continuity. So you have all the functional pieces and parts of a house, but they're put together in like an open way. When I was there being guided around the place, they told us that this really was meant to be built like a ship. And when you're inside, you feel a little bit like you're in a cruise ship that's out on the plains, which were often likened to the rolling lulls of the sea. So there are some things that are interesting about it. Another thing I found out about it, too, is that this guy was like a micromanager. He designed every fixture. Every piece of furniture. He came back to some later owners of the house who had put in a Barca lounger, and he asked them to remove it. He even designed the clothing that Mrs. Roby was supposed to wear when she showed the house. So he really put it all together in the way that an arts and crafts thinker would. So there's the fireplace you saw in the video and the high back chairs that look rather uncomfortable, but basically follow the vertical lines of the glass art windows. But so it really is a compelling space. And you can see UC Chicago is literally right across from it. But ultimately, I think he won the argument if you look at the contemporary architecture of Chicago. For this house at Bear Run, which is a creek, basically in, I believe it's Philadelphia, right outside of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, you had a very interesting industrialist patron who wanted to celebrate his favorite vacation spot, right? As you were reading in the video and reading in the article on Khan Academy, this is what basically Philip Kaufman wanted, a way to enjoy the space, more routinely. He didn't expect that the guy was going to put his design on top of the site. That was kind of a surprise. And if you guys watch some of the videos that I've given you, this plan was like thrown together. It's like he knew that the patron was coming, right? Hadn't really thought about it that much yet. He threw this, breathed it onto the site, and ultimately this is what he presents. So it's just funny how that happens with iconic works. But if you look at the site itself, the creek runs through the plan of the house. One of the stones that the family liked to use for sunbathing is actually the hearthstone right in front of the fireplace. So it's kind of like Wright really wants to bring the outside world into everything you experience at this house. It's basically anchored by what you guys see there. I'll use my laser pointer real quick. The idea is that you see this big, tall local stone proportion. That's basically what the house rests on. All of these projections stick out or jut out into nature and provide you balconies and viewing platforms that are all cantilevered to that site. Now, you remember cantilevering, that's just attached at one end. And the stuff that's actually making it possible is the actual reinforced concrete we're seeing again. Now, people are critical of the design of this house from a functional standpoint because you guys can already see cantilevering that much means that you're eventually going to have like a sag in the building, and they've constantly had to try to save this building from itself. But so far we've been successful, and what you get is a really interesting brand of Frank Lloyd Wright architecture. We need to call this kind of architecture organic architecture. Architecture or structures that speak so uniquely to the site that they're on that you really can't divorce one from the other. That was Wright's whole big idea, is that you definitely take nature and take cues from nature and try not to make a building that just sits on its site. He was critical of Villa Savoye for that reason, because it's basically something that could be built anywhere in any place at any time by anyone. But the utopians were trying to achieve exactly that. They weren't providing vacation houses for wealthy financiers or industrialists. So we're working with different patrons here. You guys can see the concrete pier is underneath the house. You can see the living room, the bedroom, everything that branches off of that central pier. I like this view because look here, you've got a suspended staircase that doesn't have a bottom. So you as a person could go down and literally drape your feet into the waterfall below. The stair had a covering over the top of it, or still has today, I should say. It's a glass like a partition, and you can open it or close it anytime you want to, but you're always going to hear the sound of the waterfall wherever you are in the house. So your experience basically is designed with the river in mind. Guys, the floor plan that you have looks a little bit different than this, but I just wanted to show you how tightly this house sits on its intended site. That's the river, okay? So it flows. You basically have, oh, I'm sorry, that's the drive, my bad. This is the river. I probably need to update this a little bit. You can see the waves there. But the house literally hugs its site as if the two are like one creature. And that's pretty significant when you talk about Frank Lloyd Wright. So here you guys can see the balconies with the waterfall running underneath. Here you can see the interior. That floor is not a texture that's been applied. That's actually the rock on the site. So I don't know how you get more outside in than this. And look at the windows, literally uninterrupted views, even as the windows go around corners. The idea is that you're basically going to try and invite the earth in. So this is just amazing kind of intentional thought about architecture and what it can or can't be. Contractors and builders might, bristle up at this stuff because they know that you're going to have a lot of problems with cantilevering and, innovative designs like this. But that's the organic style that Wright was insistent upon. As a matter of fact, he was asked at one point, such houses do not simply testify to the ideal of living in harmony with nature, they declare a war on the modern city. When asked what could be done to improve city architecture, Wright responded, tear it down. So that's pretty interesting. I mean, the guy is building initially very early in his career, helping Louis Sullivan build a modern city, and now he thinks that's kind of the enemy. I wanted to show you the Guggenheim just briefly. You don't have to know it or identify it, but ultimately it's kind of like organic architecture in the middle of New York City, right on the edge of Central Park. And it's really interesting when you consider the surrounding architecture. It was meant to be an icon of a museum, and it uses all of the organic lessons that you see in the Frank Lloyd Wright Roby House and the Fallingwater House. So I think it's a normal kind of next thing to do. The idea was to create a museum that would exhibit art in a brand new way. The central space is basically a ramp that continuously goes up to the top of that central aerial space, and the artwork is exhibited on your right side as you go up the ramp. This kind of continuous ribbon that you're seeing in the balconies and the cantilever projections, that's kind of synonymous today with hotel lobbies that are designed this way, right? So he was very much ahead of his time in building a space like this. Now, it provided problems, obviously. How do you display like a flat two-dimensional artwork on a curved surface? It's really kind of challenging. So there are additional galleries at the back of the building that are more traditional and conservative in spaces. And I'm noticing here in my video guide or my PowerPoint that you've got a Kandinsky show there. If you're interested in seeing a great collection of Kandinsky's work, you can do no better than the Guggenheim. So I would encourage you to go there. But so, you had people who loved it. You had people who hated it. You had museum gallery owners who were like, why are you going to the museum? To see the building or to see the art, right? So it introduces a whole argument about these kinds of museums. Are you there to celebrate innovation, architectural spaces and whatnot? Are you there to really focus on the art? So there are contemporary museums like the Bilbao Guggenheim that Frank Gehry comes up with that are iconic spaces. You go to see them as well as the artwork. On the other side of that, you have our Fort Worth Modern, Tadeo Ando, who says, no, we're building temples for art, and the architecture should recede so that the art can step forward. So this is still a debate today about how you design these spaces. And I think it's really interesting that it all started with Fallingwater.